All right, well, it's 2:30, so I think we're going to get started here. Hello, everyone. This is the ELTAC Subcommittee meeting here to discuss the topics of method selection for regulatory testing. I will make a note here at the very beginning that our webcast link was incorrect on our public notice. This is going out to via a Lyris message. The correct link would be the video.calepa.gov. So if you have any folks, the members of the ELTAC committee here, if you have any folks asking you, hey, the link is broken, direct them to the video.calepa.gov webpage. With that, I'd like to ask if we can get all of our ELTAC subcommittee members to unmute their microphones and share their screens. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the ELTAC subcommittee meeting. My name is Christopher Hand. I'm an environmental scientist here with the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program. With this first meeting of this ELTAC subcommittee, we actually have the distinct pleasure to have an outside facilitator, Rick Weaver. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to him. Rick.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christopher. Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor and to be able to be here to facilitate your subcommittee meeting today. Our first order of business is to do roll call. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now call each committee member's name. And as I say your name, please unmute and respond with either present or here. And we're going to start with our regulatory agency members. From the State Water Board, representing ELAP, Christopher Hand.
I'm here.
Also from the State Water Board, our Quality Assurance Officer, Andrew Hamilton.
Here.
From the Department of Toxic Substances Control, Carol Wortham.
Here.
And representing the public interest with the Natural Resources Defense Council, Corinne Bell.
Here.
Thank you. And now our laboratory members. From Pace Analytical, Judy Morgan.
I'm here.
Thank you. From Eurofins Test America, Pamela Schemmer.
I'm here.
And Pam, I'm sorry if I messed up that last name.
No, you did fine.
From Enthalpy, Peter Arth.
Present.
Wonderful. APPL Laboratories, Diane Anderson.
I'm here.
Thank you. From WEC Laboratories, Augustin Pieri.
I'm here.
Thank you. And Orange County Sanitation District, Samuel Choi.
So I will say Sam did provide us advance notice that he will be attending, but he will be late.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. All right, thanks everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for attending this subcommittee meeting of the Environmental Laboratory Technical Advisory Committee, ELTAC. As you're all aware, California's Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, ELAP, is responsible for assessing laboratories to verify they are competent in analytical methods and that the laboratories are complying with ELAP's regulatory standards for data quality and laboratory management. ELAP is partnering with the ELTAC to prepare a guidance document to assist California regulatory agencies with selecting and approving new and novel analytical methods to address emerging or difficult pollutants of regulatory concern and when accreditation is needed. I would like to emphasize, though, that there is a process for method validation and approval for use that happens at the federal level, but what we'd like this subcommittee to focus on today is what should California do in the absence of that federal process? Or likewise, when the federal process is not applicable because the pollutants of regulatory concern are state-specific, i.e. not regulated at the federal level. ELTAC has created this subcommittee for the primary purpose of developing a guidance document that will identify a framework for new analytical methods and to submit that document to them no later than September of this year of 2021. For this subcommittee meeting today, we actually have 6 items on the agenda, and I'd like to review those with you now so we're all up to, so that I can level set expectations. Number 1, to identify the scope of work to create that document. Number 2, identify a chairperson for this subcommittee. 3, to identify the deliverables, which will include a completion timeline and then the assigning of roles and responsibilities. Number 4, to review any and all action items that come as a result of this committee meeting. Number 5, to set a date for our next committee meeting, subcommittee meeting. And then lastly, to hear the pre-submitted public comments for today's meeting. In our pre-planning for this call, we had determined that it was at this point that we were going to allow for and open it up for any public comments on today's agenda items. But Kate, I understood you to tell me before we started that we're going to just do those as we're going through the meeting. Is that correct?
That's right, Rick.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So let's tell you what, let's go ahead and get started. The first item on the agenda then was to define the scope of work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it back over to Christopher for a moment, and he's going to share some foundational information that will be helpful to us as we begin to consider what a framework for this guidance document can look like. Christopher?
There we go. Now I'm unmuted, and you should hopefully see my screen here. We should have the agenda listed and the bullet point number 2 highlighted. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I see some nodding. Great. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm going to just quickly go over some of the topics that we discussed briefly at the ELTAC meeting itself to form this subcommittee meeting, just as so we're all on the same page, and then provide some thoughts and considerations that ELAP would like to see in the scope of work. So just as a formality, as a reminder, we do have staff council. I know Bagley-Keene was mentioned before, but all ELTAC subcommittees are also under the purview of Bagley-Keene. So anything that we do here needs to be done in a public forum. And ELAP is here to assist with that, the administration and noticing and those kinds of requirements. This is going to be this subcommittee's document. ELAP is an interested stakeholder in this, and so we have a seat at the table here, but we want all input from all kinds of stakeholders on this document. And this document has the potential to be used more than just in California itself. So the problem that we proposed at the full ELTAC meeting was that new and updated methodologies are available all the time. They're continually being developed, and a lot of our state regulatory agencies want them to be available for use. ELAP is often approached with sort of asking guidance and performing a consulting service, and we do have a seat to the uncertainties around the process of selecting a new method that's appropriate for the regulatory testing. So in that ELTAC meeting, I showed this very bad life cycle of a method. It's very broad because the stages aren't really consistent. It kind of depends on what standard body you want to go through in terms of what terms are used, what kind of stages are there, and ultimately what the method is going to be used for, as the methods are designed to be available to a wide range of uses. And as working in ELAP, we get to see just a little bit of the kinds of uses. This is more of a flowing scale rather than distinct phases, but we do see a general sense of where the data is going to be used for, whether it's going to be used to identify a compound to see if it's actually there, or to screen it to see how widespread is the compound found or the specific analyte of interest, or maybe we're looking at it just to see, can we see it above a certain level? Because below that, it doesn't really matter anymore. We also have the large brackets of compliance and enforcement, and that's generally the realm of things that are very established. We have very clear guidelines of what kind of methods are available and what kind of compounds we're looking at. Each of these different levels has a different level of need of certainty and a different level of need of specificity. And some food for thought is kind of which kind of categories would be accreditation be necessary, which kind of categories would accreditation be useful to have. There is this balance between method development and regulation. And one of the topics to keep in mind is, where is that transfer point when the method is no longer being developed and when it is ready for regulatory use? And I think one of the things that we all want to see in this guidance document is the minimum criteria that would be necessary to have quality data using that method for its intended use. And this document will really help create a shared understanding. We've seen a need for universal guidance that's based on sound scientific principles. I think it can be helpful to all entities here. It can help laboratories as they're designing these new methods for regulatory compounds. It'll assist state regulatory agencies to determine which methods would be appropriate to use for their intended use. And it'll help ELAP in determining how the effectiveness that we'll be able to provide accreditation for these kinds of methods. And ultimately, I think this guidance document is really designed around the core function of all of our laboratories and all of the regulatory agencies that we have here. Is they're really around designing to protect public health and the environment. And so just a few more considerations for the scope. We talked about the classification of methods. There's no real standardized terms. Each body uses their own, and each body has their own provisions that should be considered. So we will kind of want to know which ones are the best bits. What are the best bits from EPA's alternative test procedure and standard methods committee and ASTM, et cetera? And what are the minimum criteria that we should have for each level of method use? And then who's the responsible party when they're developing these? What's the laboratory's responsibility? What's the agency who's selecting these methods? What's their responsibility? And ultimately, what's ELAP's responsibility when we're doing this? And just sort of when and how California agencies should use this guidance document. Just some items to keep consideration. And with that, I think I'll pass it back to Rick.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christopher. So what I'm going to suggest is one of the best ways to get started would be for you as a subcommittee to determine which format you want to use that would be most applicable to California and to this project. As we begin to make this decision, I would encourage that we remain mindful that as we determine which format to use, that it include what entity is responsible for each piece of guidance of the guidance document, for example, labs, regulators, et cetera. While we know that each of you bring a very specific lens to this process, our ultimate goal today is to find common ground that will work for everyone on this committee and ultimately serve the document and its use. Some of the things, Christopher just gave us some really great suggestions on consideration as we're looking at scope. Some other things we might want to consider as we're having this discussion would be what actual components does this California framework need to have? Who's going to be responsible for the individual pieces of that, whether it be the regulatory organizations versus the labs? Who's the audience for this guidance document? What are some of the barriers and challenges to creating this document? And because transparency and honesty will be a key component in working together, are we prepared to bring that level of transparency and honesty to the table? Oh, and one last thing that I want to make sure that I note, ELTAC, Christopher kind of alluded to this a little bit, but ELTAC is not 100% sure of what this needs to look like. So what we want to do is have this committee define it and develop it. And as he had said, this is your document. We want you to own it. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and open it up for conversation. The interesting part about all this, and I had told Christine earlier in a pre-planning call, I'm not a scientist, so I don't really know a lot of this and I don't understand this. So my goal today is to facilitate you guys having a conversation about what this is going to look like. So in the idea of defining the scope of it, what do you, if you'd like to either raise your hand on Zoom or just raise your hand and I'll call on you if I can see you, let's just have a conversation. Let's just have an open dialogue and begin some brainstorming on this. Who would like to get us started? Now, don't everyone talk at once.
I'll jump in.
Please do. Thank you, Judy. You get a gold star for being number one.
Well, thank you. One of the things I kind of want to start out with on this is just to kind of bring up that the Environmental Protection Agency has multiple procedures out there right now. The Drinking Water Division, I think, has three, and each of them are specific to a particular chemical or biological class. The Clean Water Act has a very large ATP protocol procedure, as well as under RCRA, SW 846 actually has a method development protocol. So I bring that up because I feel like even within the EPA, there's been disparity, if you will, between the divisions as to how it gets done. I think that for a good place to be with this would be to look at those documents and bring them together and take the best of each. Because if the end game here is to have a method that has been vetted, proven, and is compliant for accreditation, bringing all of those together might be a place to start. ASTM also has a protocol for that as well.
So let me ask you a quick question. Do you foresee this guidance document being primarily consisting of previously validated methods, or is it going to be hopefully something we create new?
Well, I think it's going to be a little bit of both, because
Okay.
I think in some cases, depending on the CEC, you'll have classes of chemicals that will fit neatly into existing methods where you just expand a method protocol and expand a list. And then I think you'll have some that the chemical class will be different enough that you might be looking at like LC triple quad or some other type of technology that's far superior to what we currently have, because you're looking at sensitivity levels and separation criteria that's necessary because of a matrix.
Wonderful, thank you. Peter, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
So I think Judy brings up a good point of reinvention of the wheel should certainly not be where the majority of the time is spent on this. I kind of, based on what Chris kind of put forth, I see three levels in it. One is, maybe defining the responsibility matrix, right? Who is responsible for each part of this? Us as a laboratory is not going to say, hey, discharger, you're going to need to start regulating this new chemical that we see as a potential constituent of concern. That one's a pretty clear one. I see Chris laughing. That's helpful. But that's bucket number one. Bucket number two is probably the order of operations of, first it needs to be, is it defined as a regulatory problem first? Is it then, vetted? Do we need an analytical method for this? And then it goes into it. And then bucket number three, as Judy said, there's just too much complexity there to turn this into a document where we're going to teach everybody how to define and develop a method for each individual constituent out there, whether it's an organic or a metal or my weird ass toxicity stuff. That's too well defined. So, I would think you would reference the existing method development documents. Like Judy said, you take the best of the best that's out there and use that as a general framework of these are the validation steps that you need to go through, and where we need to build out or better emphasize or clean up some of those older documents and how the methods are developed. That's where the energy and the focus should be. But similar to writing SOPs or a QA manual, you're not going to write the whole thing out in the whole thing. Let's reference where we can to valid sections that exist, brush up and clean up the areas that we need to, and then take into account, this should be a forward-looking document of, like Judy said, there's new technology being developed all the time. So let's see what we can put in there to get ahead of what might be coming 10, 20 years down the road as we help to define the basic rubric of what is needed, as opposed to getting into the nitty-gritty of exactly what you need to do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. And, so both you and Judy have talked about the idea of referencing already existing documents. So I'm going to go back to one of the things that I had offered up as one of the things that we need to at least be aware of is what are the challenges that are going to be in taking that body of pre-existing documentation and synthesizing it down? How easy and or hard is it going to be for this subcommittee to do that? Peter, since you were the last who spoke, I'm going to let you start off by answering that.
Yeah, I'll be honest and say that I'm going to defer a little bit. So to give you some general scope, my expertise is in aquatic toxicology. It's a relatively small component of the overall environmental monitoring scheme. Most of the other folks on this call are all from chemistry labs. So, in terms of what exists right now in my world for method development, it's pretty thin. So, I don't know that it's going to be as challenging for the specialty that I bring to the table to be able to define that. I would defer to, either Pierre or Judy or some of the other folks from the chem side to let us know how challenging it's going to be for their world, because I think the drinking water and the environmental samples, solids and liquids, are going to be a much heavier lift.
Wonderful, thank you. And since Augustin, he called you out, I'm going to call on you. How would you respond to that question?
Yeah, like Peter mentioned, it's a bit more complicated, and like also Judy said, that we are dealing with a lot of new technologies and things, but it's not, I think, out of control complicated. I think it's something that this group has a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge and experience that we can probably put something together that would be, I think, robust to hold up for a while. And this is something that we're going to be putting together, not for today and not for the legacy things. It'll be for use in the future, and what stuff will come out. So yeah, I think it's something that we could all put together and get going.
So the good news is we've got a starting point, because there's already documentation out there that we can begin to use as a framework. Wonderful, thank you. Corinne, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so my only experience on this front is with the frustration of having a lack of certified methods or uncertainty with methods that are available. And so from my perspective, I would like to, maybe we could shake out two different circumstances. One where you have a pollutant that is carcinogenic and we know it's a tremendous public health problem. How much certainty do you need in the method for an instance like that? And then if you have a pollutant that maybe isn't as troublesome from a public health perspective, you might want or require more certainty for the test method certification. Yeah, so that's what I'm thinking. Also, in terms of like setting a timeline too, can we put a stop time? You have to have a method certified in a year or 6 months or whatever might be reasonable, but just advise that there is a timeline that's in place.
Wonderful, thank you, Corinne. Judy.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with what Corinne was saying, just simply because I think part of the reason why there's several different procedures that exist within EPA is because many of them were developed matrix specific or for a class of compounds in a particular matrix. So I think, from the standpoint of like drinking water, I mean, clearly you shouldn't have as many issues developing a method in something that's supposedly clean as to what you would have coming out from a treatment plant or an industry or something like that, or even just groundwater or, something under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. So I think understanding what we're trying to, what we're trying to do with this and have a piece in there that allows us to bucket the chemicals in the matrices of what we're trying to accomplish.
Wonderful, thank you. Christopher, when you were showing your considerations for scope slide, I actually took a screenshot of it. I want to jump back to something under the bullet point of classification of developing methods. The first bullet point was approval body processes. What should California consider, approve, and accept? Let me just ask the question, does everyone on this subcommittee feel like that is an integral part of what this guidance document needs to have in it? Is there any objection to that? All right, I want to move on to the next one under that same bullet point. What minimum criteria should be considered? Would that be some level, and I don't know, again, I'm not a scientist and I don't understand this, but to Judy's point that she just made, would that fall into a matrix that would or would not fit in this document? Minimum criteria, is that something that needs to be in this guidance document? I'm seeing head shaking. Peter, go for it.
Yeah, again, I think that one of the bigger challenges that we're going to face that we got to get past is how how specific are we going to be, and how, granular is the guidance going to be? I think that the answer is fundamentally yes. There should be minimum criteria that go into what's required to develop the method. I think it's the challenge we're going to face is how granular that minimum requirement is going to be, and then how you balance those requirements based on the diversity of individuals that are being asked to participate and work in this. So the answer is yes, it should be there. I think that we're just going to have to sort of do a little trial and error along Judy's lines of bucketing things out. And there may be variation among them. Maybe that's part of the discussion, is depending upon. I think step one is we're going to need to decide what the buckets are. Are we going to be matrix buckets? Are we going to be, analytical method buckets? What are the buckets going to be? And once we get to that point, we can start putting some more framework around what the requirements to develop those methods are going to look like.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Pam, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think that the document needs to cover how we establish minimum criteria, but I don't think it can cover minimum criteria that covers every method. I think that that's been a flaw in some guidances, like SWA 46 said, oh, well, if you add something new, it's going to have to hit 70 to 130. Well, not everything does. And so I think, some of the points that I've heard is we have to look at the risk. What are we coming up with? What's the reason why we're looking for this compound? What's the matrices, as Judy has indicated, that's going to change this criteria. And then what is the technology that we have available to use? If at the time that we try and establish a need to get analytical services out there, and the best any process can do is hit 30 to 170%, maybe that's what it's going to be, but we have to take all those into consideration. So I would not recommend that this document say, for drinking waters, we're going to hit 50 to 150. For clean waters, we're going to hit, 60 to 140. It covers how we establish the risk and the basis based on what's available to us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I also wanted to throw out, just for consideration, as Christopher did, what items and who should review: the laboratory's responsibility, the agency's responsibility, and ELAP's responsibility. So just let me ask you, as a subcommittee, do you feel like it's going to be easy to identify those levels of responsibility inside this document? Is it going to be tough, or is it going to be easy or hard to be able to do that? And or does it need to be in this document? Yeah, Peter, go for it.
I hate to come up with the same answer every time, but it's just going to depend on the level of complexity that you put to it. We can make it pretty easy, or we can make it extremely challenging. It's just going to come down to how granular the detail is. I'll tell you the question of who and what is going to probably bring some amount of discussion, if you will, around different parties feeling that they should have an input or a seat at the table, or that's not my decision, or that is your decision. I think we can probably get to the level of making suggestions in this, but putting hard guidelines around it is going to be challenging. To Pamela's point, that level of detail that she's bringing up, the recovery ranges for the compounds, I don't think that we'll get down to that level in this, but I think one thing to consider as we go around and look at what the responsible parties are is who is going to make that decision. In my mind, as we look at it, that's somewhere in between the regulators and ELAP of saying, if ELAP has a heart attack, when you said you can only get a 20% recovery out of this, then that's something that I think needs to be addressed. So the order of operations of how we kind of put this framework together, I think, is going to be probably the most critical step that this group walks away with today, is whether that's, everybody coming with their own ideas and us reconvening and sort of throwing them out on the table, or we try to put together some sort of a rubric or a structure of what are the major buckets, if you will, that need to be created and addressed. That I kind of see as one of the critical factors. I think the discussion we're having now, starting to try to put some frames around it, is good, but to really get the process started, I think we're going to have to sort out sort of what the major areas that we're looking at are.
Wonderful. Thank you. Augustin.
I mean, I agree with all the stuff that Peter said and everything else, but we should also frame it from a perspective of who's going to use this data, right? Like if we look at what the data quality objectives are for generating this, then it could kind of maybe guide who's going to review this, who's going to review that, or what the acceptance criteria would be, or like what Corinne said of what kind of targets would need what kind of specificity or sensitivity or all that stuff, and maybe kind of try to take that into account to guide this a little bit.
So let me ask you this question, because I wish we had more time. We only have an hour and a half for this subcommittee meeting, and we've got a lot to get accomplished. Let me ask you the question to the entire subcommittee. What is the first component that needs to be in this document? What would you see as being the very first thing? You know, I had taken, in trying to familiarize myself a little bit with this, I had gone to EPA's Clean Water Act website, and some of the things that they had listed there were actually quite informative. They listed things like the rules summary and section to identify approved methods, other methods and alternative procedures, regulatory history, toxic and priority pollutants list, a legal authority for methods. And I was wondering how much of that kind of stuff, if any, belongs in this document. And I really, because what we're trying to do is create a framework, right? So what needs to be the very first thing in this, if we're building an outline for this guidance document, what is the first thing that needs to be in there? Pam.
Oops, sorry. I think that you mentioned it right there. Sorry, everything's kind of messed up here. Whether or not there is a method that exists or is similar, I think I heard you say something to that point, that we need to do the research before we go out and develop the rule. And I think that framework for doing that research as to what's possible needs to be part of this.
Wonderful, thank you. What are other, if we were just doing a bullet pointed list of individual components that this document needs to have, what are some additional bullet points that we need to have? I heard Augustin mention who's going to use the data, which I had mentioned the audience. Who is this document being driven to? What are some other bullet points that we need to add to this outline? Yeah, Augustin, go for it.
Yeah, so I mean, same lines of what I already mentioned, but I think that maybe the first thing we should think about is why are we even looking at this? Why are we making a new method? What's the driver? Is there a regulatory push? Is somebody's finding this in the environment and it needs to have a method or something like that? Maybe we should first establish who needs it and why they need it, and then go from there. Maybe then look at existing methods and sensitivity and all that stuff. But maybe up front we should say what's the driver for creating a new method or evaluating if we need a new method.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm trying to type as we are talking. Peter, then Judy.
I'd almost go one step further backwards than what Augustin did, which is what in the end do we need to have included in this? Is this looking at a full-fledged front to back process of there is this unknown contaminant that's sitting out there and we're going to walk it all the way through how it becomes potentially regulated, who decides what the regulation is and the interaction between the development of the method and what the regulatory limits are? Or is the goal of this to just say, after all of that has been figured out by somebody on the state board or the federal side, we as laboratories are now being asked to do this work, and what is the appropriate steps to go through to develop a method to address that?
Would
So
that I was just going to say, because I'm looking at some of the comments previously, would that not be addressed in why we need it, why we need to create this?
Fair enough. I mean, if that is truly, because I think, trying to bullet point the outline list is if we all agree that we want to see something soup to nuts on on the process, then it becomes a little clearer what the first, few bullet points of this are going to be. I'm just not sure that the parties that are sitting at this table are necessarily going to be able to speak to some of those regulatory drivers and concerns of why an analyte gets chosen to be put on a list to start being regulated.
So I'm going to ask a very odd question based upon the fact, and again, I'm not part of you guys, so I'm just still learning, but based upon the fact that ELTAC created this subcommittee to do this, it would just, my assumption is there's a belief that you are the people that could do this. Am I wrong, Peter?
So no, I mean, we are the group in terms of putting together guidance on how to validate analytical methods for use and some of the considerations that need to be taken, because, the driver behind this creation of the subcommittee to some extent is that, there are new things that are being regulated. There are folks that are being held to these regulations, and then they're looking at the laboratories and saying, okay, I need my data to show that I am in or not in compliance for this. And there's a disconnect sometimes, as Corinne brought up, of the speed sometimes at which something becomes a problem and then has a regulation put in place. And sometimes there's a skip ahead
Right.
of how the method is created and validated prior to a regulation coming in on it. But the answer to your question is fundamentally yes. Yes, this is the group of people that can do this, but part of it is defining the scope.
Sure.
mean, we're not the ones that are making the rules of this compound should be regulated. What we're trying to provide influence for is, to what a lot of the other people have said. Okay, now that you've decided that this is something that should be tested and regulated, what are the limitations that need to be applied and uncovered to be able to have a validated method that can fill the data needs of whatever the end user party is.
Wonderful, thank you. Judy.
You caught me taking notes. So just kind of to expand basically on what Peter has said as well. I mean, it goes back to applicability. I mean, really the applicability of what we're trying to do, the justification, if you will. I mean, I know in a business world, we always have a justification process for anything that we do. So from the standpoint of what program that would be looking to regulate this particular class of compounds or this particular chemical, as well as existing current data points, and then comparability between those data points. Because usually if somebody's regulating something, it's because there's data from somewhere, and it's usually from multiple places. It could be research institutions, so on and so forth, those sorts of things. And how comparable is that data? And then, of course, the potential breadth of the contamination, just like with PFAS, PFAS, they think it's everywhere, and it is, but we just don't know how everywhere it is, which is the reason why there's such a movement towards it. So that's kind of where I think we are. And from the standpoint of this being the right group, I believe it is, just simply because I think this group is well-rounded and very connected. I think we have the resources to get to other people that we may need. And, from the standpoint of what Corinne had said about speed, how long it takes to get a method, out there, all three programs have tried to address this amazingly. RCRA from the standpoint of the methods innovation rule, drinking water from the standpoint of getting methods out as soon as they are written, and then the same thing with clean water with their mini MERS. And clearly, they're still not getting things done in a fast process. So, and I think we could, just simply because we know all the history.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you very much. So far, I've got basically, and I've been kind of trying to synthesize some information. I've got 4 items in this potential framework, with one being the first being, why are we offering a new method? Who needs it? Why do they need it? What are the drivers for creating the new method? Number 2, what are the other methods that are available? Doing our research, doing our recon, trying to make sure that we're not recreating the wheel. Number 3, who's going to use the data? The audience as well as the applicability. And then I've kind of heard it as a common thread through some of the conversations in this idea of accountability. And I don't even know if accountability needs to be in a guidance document. But I thought along the lines of if it's ever going to get to a point of accreditation, some accountability needs to be there. What other points need to be in this? Because I want to make sure I'm managing time well. We've got to move on to some other items. Or what other bullet points need to be in this framework? Sam, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Yeah, sorry for being late.
That's okay.
And I think it's been already talked about, but just in case, I think there's the other component of it is the validation. Once the method is developed, how are you going to validate that method? You know, are we going to have commercial laboratories, maybe like municipal laboratories, government agencies with laboratories that are going to be all kind of be part of this multi-validation? I think that's important because we want to make sure that it's not just a single laboratory that's essentially going to validate this method. So just wanted to throw that out there as maybe an element to add on to this.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you did. Thank you very much. So now we've got 5 items in this beginning framework for this guidance document. Why? What are the other methods available? Who is the end user, the audience, some level of it, something about accountability and the validation of the method. What other bullet points need to be in this framework? Because folks, we are starting today making these decisions. We're not going to create the document today, but we are laying the outline for it, the roadmap. What's not here that you believe needs to be in this document? Because all right, Andrew, welcome.
Yes. I think my first point should be clear that this is only guidance. As to the previous commenter, I think if we're going to frame this, it should be more on the validation criteria that should drive or indicate whether or not the data that's going to be received from this method is of high quality, and really showcasing what QC elements or how do the laboratories validate their method to show the data users that method is of high quality for their use. And really, that decision doesn't rely with us. It doesn't rely with this committee. It really is the data users. And the authority to make that decision doesn't rely with us. It lies with the programs, the regional boards, or the permit authorities, and or even the federal government based on what program it is being. So although we can provide guidance, I think that the adherence to that guidance should not be so formalized as far as that. Although, as saying I'm the quality assurance officer, I do love the idea of having a uniting document that kind of provides that guidance for, say, a program that doesn't know what to look for when someone says, we want to use this method, can we use this for this purpose? And they don't understand what to look for. I think that's the real kind of utility to this document, because outside of that, it's we have to understand the nuance of the authority to accept these criteria, this guidance, and it becomes, like Peter mentioned many times, it becomes very outside the realm of this group.
So thank you for that. And it kind of also, Diane, hang tight. I'm going to call on you after Carol. So it kind of, you're the second person that I've heard really elevate the idea that it's about this is a suggestions, this is guidance, as opposed to the accountability piece. So thank you very much for that. It's kind of like the difference between a suggestion and a strong suggestion. Carol, and then Diane.
Well, I can tell you one thing in coming from assisting with the regulators. I mean, you're dealing with people who develop regulations and potentially laws without the knowledge of laboratories. So a lot of times they are looking at you as the subject matter experts to help them determine. And especially with ELAP, they look at ELAP as having the expertise to help them identify if a method is valid or not valid and usable or not usable. So this guidance document will help them as well to try and help determine that. And especially if, to piggyback on Andrew, we put in some minimum suggested criteria or minimum things that you should have in support of the validation of your method or something like that, that will help the laboratories understand what they need to gather and have available to validate this method. Plus, then the regulators on their side can look and say, do they have these pieces? And based on this committee, which is a knowledgeable committee on science and on laboratory methods, has suggested that these are viable and beneficial for validation of a method, they can then look and say, okay, this laboratory has those guidances, has those suggestions made in this. And so I have more confidence as a regulator in adopting that method because it's gone through this scientific process of validation.
Thank you so very much, Carol. So I added minimum suggested criteria for the state of California. And it may go past that, but we're starting there. Diane. Oh, you're muted.
Sure, I'm not.
Now you're not. That is the favorite phrase of 2020.
Well, most people wish I had a mute button. But I think the bullet points that we're coming up with are very good. I'd like to stress the use of the data. And then I'd like to dovetail that back to what Judy said about looking at what's already out there and seeing if we can mesh it together. Because based on what the final use of the is going to be, some methods are going to require just a boatload of QC and others not so much. And I think we should be aware of that. Maybe we're going to look at some sort of a screening method versus definitive method. And that the QC for those is going to be different and that we should take that into consideration. But I think all of that could be found in going back to the methods, the way the methods are looked at now through the EPA, and tailoring those to our needs.
Wonderful, thank you. And what I did on I added to the who's going to use the data, I added who's going to use the data and how. How are they going to use the data? Wonderful, whether it be the audience or the applicability. So folks, I've got 5 items that we have apparently all agreed upon. I don't hear any massive opposition. 1, why are we offering a new method? Who needs it? Why we need it? Drivers. What are the drivers for creating the new method? 2, massive research and understanding on other methods that are currently out there and how we may be able to use those. Number 3, who's going to use the data and how. Number 4, the validation of the method. And number 5, minimum suggested criteria for the state of California for this project. Is there any other bullet point, because we've got to move on, we're running out of time. Is there any other bullet point that you feel like you got to have on here for us to be able to get this project started? All right, wonderful. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the next item on our agenda.
Rick.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, it's Kate. Yeah, so
Hey, Kate.
we have one public commenter on this item. Erica Calve would like to comment.
Wonderful. Please, Erica, please go right ahead.
All right, so thank you, Kate, for pointing that out. And so hi, my name is Erica Calve, and I'm a senior engineering geologist I'm overseeing or the supervisor for the pretreatment and constituents of emerging concern unit at the State Water Board. I'm helping to implement the State Water Board CEC initiative, and we're in the process of developing a statewide management and monitoring plan so that we can kind of address what sounds like to be something that you guys are going to be commenting quite a bit on. And so we have some concerns about, the possibility for unintended consequences of this guidance document coming out and potentially doing, resulting in a situation where where it ties our hands behind our back from being able to move forward with using some of the innovative methods that are out there and are part of what we believe is our toolbox. Our CEC management monitoring program and any CEC monitoring that we do, is really guided through an expert panel process. We've had several science advisory panels over the course of the last 12 years, helping us understand the CEC issue. They have provided us guidance on the types of analytical methods we should explore, how we go about exploring those methods while ensuring some level of quality that will meet the needs of the program, and so that we're producing data that's of known quality for the types of information that we need to guide the process through the discovery of an emerging contaminant in California's waters to actually moving forward with development of standards for trying to help address the problem. So, you guys are already aware of the challenges around waiting for the EPA process for developing a new method is, sometimes 20 years in the making for certain matrices and certain contaminants of concern. So we are very supportive and interested in what California can do to help support, the streamlining of that process. But there were some things said today that I made me worry about, in particular, the comment about this somehow like having sway over the way, having some sort of overlap with the implementation of regulations for monitoring or responding. I think Andrew said it really well in terms of like kind of the scope of the project to provide that guidance that helps us do the work that we need to do. But there are several programs within the water boards and several programs outside of the water boards that need to use research type techniques to help us understand what we need to know to be able to do our jobs the best that we can. And so, and I guess I'll just echo a couple of the comments that I heard from the last, when the subcommittee meeting was first brought up in January, when I don't know who it was, I didn't catch the name, but somebody had said something that toxicity testing is like the Wild West because it's not instrument based, and it seemed as if that was something that like might be addressed as part of the subcommittee's considerations. But I would hope that, to the extent that we need to use those tools as they are today, and we have used those tools and it's informed us along the way, that there's nothing that comes out of this guidance document that somehow discredits what has been done, what needs to be done, and the work that we are doing moving forward, or even necessarily say that thou shalt accredit these methods, because that may not be appropriate. And so I just really hope that at the end of the day, there is not some sort of output that comes out that somehow like ties our hands. There were other comments that I thought were great, and they've been echoed again today, which is, I think the idea of like making a California specific guidance and that it integrates and takes the best of the existing guidance that's out there and makes it easier for us to all understand what we need to do to move forward with accreditation. But the underlying assumption should always be that program managers have the ability, as a regulator, we have the ability and the responsibility to identify when to engage with ELAP, and any suggestions that go beyond that scope, such as indicating that certain methods should be accredited if they are not, could undermine our work. And I just really hope that as you guys move forward, you keep that in mind, and you don't undermine the previous work or the work that we need to do moving forward. And to try to mitigate for such an issue, I think that you've talked about stakeholders, bringing them to the table. I think stakeholder engagement is a really important thing. I'm personally happy to come back with a presentation that explains from the CEC perspective, especially since it seems like you guys are talking a lot about constituents of emerging concern. My program may be like one of the biggest stakeholders at the table right now in terms of what you may come out with that like could impact the way that we operate. And that for a guidance document to do something like that would be, I think, unfortunate. And so I'd really like to be able to share our perspective in detail so that you can keep that in consideration as you move forward, so that, you know, we avoid those unintended consequences.
Wonderful, Erica. Thank you so very much for your comments. I'm going to take the responses in the order that the hands were raised. It'll be Peter, then Christopher, then Judy, then Carol.
So I'm just going to jump in because it was my wild west comment on the last call. So, you know, I don't, Erica, I think your concerns are totally understandable, and at least in my mind, from my perspective, I mean, our lab does, you know, more method development, R&D type of stuff on a regular basis alongside the, you know, very regulated compliance type testing that's there. And I think there's a place for both of those. I personally, I don't see this as an exercise to try to pin down, and this is why I keep getting with the granular comment. I don't think it needs to be that granular. And I think, going back to the data use idea, I think there should be carve outs for, you know, what is considered, you know, more of an R&D type of exercise, and, you know, going out and doing more exploratory work than, you know, the other side, which is, you know, looking at the way the dischargers are being regulated. I mean, if you have a mandatory minimum penalty assigned to a constituent that you might violate, you are going to want a certain level of QC to go with that method so that you know. But to your point, you know, I don't think the goal of the doc is not to limit what should be accepted or what should be okay. And if we need to put clear carve outs in there for that to make it clear, you know, like you said, the state board, as both you and Andrew have said, you know, I mean, y'all are the rule makers here. So, you know, I mean, it's about how you're using the data and what you want it for. And I don't think that the purpose of this is to put hard and fast rules around stuff that is more exploratory, because you have to be able to do the science and do the research to get us to the point of where something is or is not regulated or needs to not be regulated. So it's my 2 cents on it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Christopher.
Yeah, and I think this has been summarized pretty well. I think, Rick, you put it at point number 5 of this document really should consider who is going to be using the data and how it is going to be used. And those should be 2, or at least should be a major focus in determining what sort of quality control or quality assurance criteria that need to be present in that kind of document. And to point out to Erica that this is coming from ELAP seeing this from lots of different regulatory agencies. So while the Water Board is the largest by far partner in this determination, we do have a lot of other agencies that really don't have the wonderful laboratory experience that a lot of the folks here have, and it doesn't have access to either ELAP in general or the wonderful relationship that ELAP has with the water boards and us being able to communicate quite effectively. And so, you know, this document we really want it to be able to be used across the state, regardless of what an agency is doing it, regardless of what agency needs the regulatory data. But as folks here have touched on, the regulatory entity is ultimately the responsible party for just selecting which methods they want to use and how they want to use those. But I think having point 5 here, and who's going to be using the data and how it's going to be used, I think needs to be a major consideration for this document.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So
thank you very much. Judy, you're up next.
Yep. So just to kind of dovetail off of what Christopher just said, one of the things I think that would be important to clarify at the beginning of the document is the purpose of when the document or the protocol applies. Because I think what it comes down to is not so much whether or not this document will stifle somebody else's process or, you know, override something that somebody else is already doing. It's really more of a fit for use kind of thing from the standpoint of the options to use the document depending on your intended purpose. So, I mean, I think that, you know, it's important to understand that this document is not for the discovery end of things when you're just trying to determine what the contaminants are, but for the monitoring part of it so that you can quantify, track, and consistently be able to identify and quantitate what you're tracking or monitoring.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. All right. Carol, you're up next.
Okay, I think in this process, we never ever declared that we were going to state in this document that this is how you get a method ready for accreditation. I don't think that's necessarily our place to state, but at the same time, you need to have a consistent validation type process. Even in ISO 17025, they state if you're modifying a method for a new matrix or for addition of compounds, or if you're flat out creating it from scratch, you have to have a process for validating that method, for showing the confidence in the numbers that you're generating. And that's all they say. And they leave it up to everybody to try and figure out what that means for their laboratory. I more kind of see this as maybe California's version of EPA's method validation, where we look at closer to, we have needs for screening, which only requires a certain type of validation. Then we have needs for monitoring or regulation reporting that's going to need a different, and how we can help just kind of show this is the type of information that you need to have to put confidence in the methods that you're preparing, so that regulatory agencies can use them. And then it's going to be up to the regulatory agency to move down the line. I mean, if you look at the history of flame retardants material or flame retardant compounds in the firefighting foams and things like that, it started off with about a research about these flame retardants and what happens to them and how they progress on. And it was multiple studies and developing sound methods to use them that eventually worked its way down to regulation of those compounds. So ultimately, the work that we've done and do in developing new methods for whatever purposes that we're developing them, or for whoever needs to develop them, will potentially open the door for regulation down the line. And it would be helpful for California to be able to turn around and say, hey, to have for the people using your data to have confidence in it on a screening level, on a monitoring level, this is some of the minimum stuff you need to have. And that's kind of how I see the progress of this document. It's guidance. We're not telling you what you have to do, but with the knowledge and the expertise that we have all as chemists and all as dealing with the laboratory, we know what you need to have confidence. We know where the pitfalls are. And this document should be outlining that for a laboratory to be able to say, I can pull this document, I can use information from here to verify and validate my method, and then people can have confidence using it.
Carol, thank you so much. So correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing just kind of consistently and overarching is this document is about suggested minimum criteria in a bunch of different buckets, but it's not going to be about mandates. It's going to be about suggestions. Is that a fair statement? I need head shaking. Yes or no? Thank you very much. Okay, great. Erica, I hope that some of those comments addressed your wonderful. Thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda, which is for us to be able to move this process along, we need to identify a chairperson for this committee. Since this is a fairly informal process at this point, I'd like to just simply ask for volunteers. Who would like to be willing to chair this subcommittee to help guide us to the completion of our goals? In thinking about that, before all of you jump and start raising your hands, this person's role will be significant. And some of the expectations of the position will be really about keeping the subcommittee on track once we create the timelines, to coordinate the meetings, to ensure accountability for the subcommittee with all of the different moving pieces of it as we're building the document. And lastly, in addition to chairing, that person will need to identify a scribe for each of the subcommittee meetings. So what I'd like to do is I'd just like to get some consensus on this. Who is there anyone here that would like to volunteer to be the chair of this subcommittee? I'll send Starbucks coffee cards to whoever raises their hand first. Oh, someone wants to do this. You know, I remember when we were doing our pre-planning calls, I asked Jacob, I was like, so what if like 5 people want to chair this committee? And that never came up as a topic of consideration.
I'm not volunteering, but I would wonder from the rules perspective or from the committee's perspective, whether for something, I mean, like you said, I think this is going to be not a tremendous lift, but a significant one to some extent. I'm wondering
Right.
for something this size, whether folks would be open to a chair, co-chair type of a thing, so it doesn't fall on one person.
There we go.
shoulders to
That's a great
try
suggestion.
to knock the whole thing out.
That's
And
a
also
great
you could get a
suggestion.
little strength weakness play off of one each other. Because I'm full of ideas, but I'm not organized worth a spit. So
Well, thank you for your honesty. And that's a great suggestion. Thank you very much. Would everyone be open to a chair, co-chair environment? Head shaking up or down, yes or no? Judy?
I would be open to that. My biggest issue is I have a time constraint on being able to do to do the planning and that sort of thing. I mean, I am happy to do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to the information, but I would not be the person to depend on for getting the thing coordinated, getting a scribe and that sort of thing, but certainly happy to help with all of the rest of it from the standpoint of getting things done and keeping it on track.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
I'll jump in here and say that ELAP is here to offer that kind of support. So you need us to send out doodle polls for when everyone can meet. We can take care of that. We can take care of all the noticing requirements for the Bagley Keene and keep on top of all that administrative stuff. We'll be happy to help with that.
Thank you, Christopher. Judy, let me ask you a question. If we had someone who was willing to chair it, would you be willing to co-chair it?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So who is going to be willing to be our chairperson? Augustine, I'm looking right at you. I know you can't see that, but I'm looking right at you.
It felt like you were looking at me. So I mean, I've never chaired something like this before. I'm happy to do it with Judy's help. I think Judy has a lot of experience with it. So maybe if I could rely on that, I'd be happy to do it.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think one of the beautiful, and thank you, Christopher, for reminding us that we do have some administrative support from ELAP. I think that will also ease some of the burden of that. And I think between you and Judy, Augustine, y'all will do an amazing job. So everyone, please welcome our chair and co-chair, Augustine Pieri and Judy Morgan. Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to our next agenda item, which is to identify some deliverables, talking about timeline for completion, as well as assigning roles and responsibilities. I do want to remind everyone that the September deadline for this document is in effect, basically, it's the last ELTAC meeting of the year, at which point they're going to vote on that, on the guidance document, or just vote on next steps or decide what next steps are to be at that point. So we've got until September to get this done. So let's talk about a timeline. How often, let me just throw this out there because I don't know how ELTAC works. Do you guys see needing to get together like once a month on a Zoom call to discuss this, to look at timeline, or to look at accountabilities and progress on the document? Do you see it being more than that, less than that? I'm not familiar with your environment, so I'm just going to ask the question: how often because I am a big believer. I get the opportunity to work with a lot of boards of directors in the world that I live in. And one of the things that I do is when I'm contracting with an organization to build a long-term strategic plan, an action plan, a business plan, a marketing plan, we always build in progress monitoring, right? So where are we along the way? We just need to make sure, because Augustine and Judy are going to be kind of our guides to help us make sure that we're staying on track, but we need to have some ideas put into place. How often do we need to come together to check in on our progress against the plan? And I tell you what, I'm just going to open it up to our new chair and co-chair first. Augustine, what do you think?
I mean, I think monthly would be good. More than that might be tough. I know a lot of people are busy. Everybody's busy, really.
Sure.
So monthly would work for me if that works for you guys. I think something that we can keep track of everything and stay on top of what we need. And if we find after a couple of meetings, we need more meetings, fewer meetings, we can adjust from there.
Wonderful. Does everyone feel comfortable with once a month? And let me ask the question differently. Knowing that the deadline is, Corinne, I'll be with you in just one second. Knowing that the deadline is September, what does once a month, and then we could always change it as we got closer, but does once a month feel like enough to be able to get it pulled together to submit to ELTAC by September? Anyone have major opposition to that? Judy, I'm going to let you answer my question because I think you're trying to answer my question, correct?
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, so I think we can try once a month. What we need is a good plan.
Correct.
And if we've got a good plan and we can make sure that we're staying on track with that, I think this is a group of workers. I don't think there's going to be a problem at all getting the job done, but I think we're going to have to make sure that we stay on the path to know if we can hit that September deadline. We come up on June or so and say we're not where we need to be, we might want to ramp it up a little bit.
Okay.
But I think we'll have to do like a review in there somewhere to determine.
Absolutely wonderful. Pam and Carol had your hand up, but before I let you speak, Corinne, did you have something you wanted to say? I know you lowered your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, my calendar tends to book up like 6 weeks in advance, unfortunately. And so monthly could be a tough lift for me, unless we were to set those dates out now. And also I know that I probably have a little bit more to come up to speed than everybody else, but if it comes to me, like doing research on methods, for example,
right,
I'm gonna need more than a month between now and when we
okay.
meet. Yeah.
And I love that suggestion. I know one of the goals for us today was to get our next committee meeting date set, but maybe we could just set them all between now and the end of the year. If we see how that goes. So Pamela, then Pam, then Carol, then Judy.
So I was just looking ahead. We've got about 5 months, April, May, June, July, August. We've got about 5 sections. And I think in order to get it from, going through those to September, where we're presenting to the ELTAC meeting, I think that we're probably going to need more frequent meetings once we get that rough draft so that we have it polished. So maybe, go ahead and start with the monthly. If Corinne has problems now, maybe we're not going to be able to meet again until later April, but come up with good communications that we can get started on, good things that we can start looking at. And then, maybe through early summer, start on this monthly and then move them to a bi-monthly so we can polish it up before the presentation.
And so thank you for that. And so maybe what we do is just set the next date and then we'll just take it as we go and see what our progress looks like. So thank you for that, Pam. Carol.
Yeah, following on the back of what Pam said, we all talked about the fact that we needed to look at the various different validation options associated with ASTM versus SW 846 versus Clean Water Act. That's going to take time to sit and research those and organize the information, as to what the different needs are and where they piggyback and things like that. So I could see needing a month to sit and do those kind of research activities. And then when we actually start writing the document, I could see where we want to meet more often so that we could take care of and deal with the amendments to the document and the changes as we get closer. So it won't be so much that we're needing the time to do the research or to write up a section, as we will be tightening up what we have written.
What you've already written. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Peter.
I have a procedural question I do not remember what the email limit is. Are we allowed to do some of this just via email, or is this exceeding the number of people that can be on the email?
I'm going to pitch this over to our staff counsel. We have Thomas Schuman here with the Office of Chief Counsel here at the State Water Resources Control Board. We did ask about Bagley-Keene earlier. So we are allowed to communicate. From what I know, we are allowed to communicate with each other. It's once we hit the quorum of members it becomes a problematic, and that's quorum of members either in one large email chain or through a serial communication. So we keep forwarding and forwarding and forwarding it, and then we hit a certain point. So I'll pitch it over to Tom for a little bit more discussion on that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom.
I'll put myself on video. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I think Christopher did an excellent job kind of summarizing the main points of Bagley-Keene. And I apologize if there's a more specific question that I missed. So if someone could repeat that.
Yeah, the specificity of the question. So it's going to come before my next comment on this, which is, this group that is the committee for this. Are we under the quorum size or are we over the quorum size so that, we could be doing some of this via email as opposed to, having to ramp up the in-person meetings, especially in the beginning?
So since this subcommittee was formally created by the larger ELTAC, it's actually considered a separate body for purposes of Bagley-Keene, which means that you don't measure the quorum relative to the entire ELTAC. You're your own, mini ELTAC. So basically, if there's a majority of people who are part of this subcommittee, you can't have communications outside of the public process. That's just what the law says.
Cool. Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew.
Sorry, let me unmute there. Does that mean if we're sending around email drafts of documents that hit every member, then we violate that? Isn't it any communication that's connected?
Yes. Yes. So if there's any communication between a majority of subcommittee members, that has to take place in compliance with open meeting requirements. And that would include both if you send a single email to a majority of the members, but it also includes if, say, you send it to two other members and then they forward it to other members. So that's what's called a serial communication. So if it ends up being distributed to a majority of the members, then that would have to comply with the open meeting requirements. That's what the law says.
So no is the fundamental.
So no is the final answer there.
On email. Okay.
So
my only point in comment in bringing it up is that I completely agree with what Carol said that that the research is going to be part of it. I think it's going to be super critical in the first few weeks of this that we develop a basic outline of what we want to be covered in this, led by our lovely chair folks in this, so that, it'll be easy enough to start splitting some specialty sections out. And of course, selfishly, I'm speaking for myself as the toxicology guy here, that, I know I'm going to be doing a lot of my own work on this. So, I think the sooner we can get an outline together, it's a shame that we can't get that around on email to have people input and comments without having to get back together and do it in a public forum, but we could try to make it work.
Thank you very much. So Christopher, you look like you're about to open your mouth.
Yeah, I do want to clarify here. I'm pretty sure, now Tom, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure you can still work in small groups as long as the group does not exceed the quorum of members. So at this point, it would be, we can work in groups no larger than 5 members because there are 10 members on this LCAT subcommittee.
Yes, that's correct. As long as it's under a quorum, that's fine. So if the subcommittee wanted to delegate a task to a smaller group to work on, as long as they kept that work within their group until the next subcommittee meeting when they could share it, that would comply with the meeting law.
Just so I'm 100% clear on this, if Judy and Augustine put together an outline they are not allowed to individually send it to all of the members here to have them comment on it, correct? Because that would touch each of us and then they would receive that information back.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Okay,
very
wonderful. Thank you, Carol.
How does a team site associate with that? So potentially we could create a team site for all these subcommittee members, and let's say the document is posted to the site where everyone could have access to review and add comments. But we're not sending 10 individual emails out to people.
Tom?
I think if there's a shared document where individual members are allowed to make comments that the rest of the committee members can then see, unfortunately, that would not, I don't think that would be allowed.
Bummer.
I'm sorry, but it's fairly strict in what it allows.
Wonderful, thank you. Augustin?
What if that document was visible to the public? Would that be problematic? I mean, it would satisfy the requirements of Bagley Keene, I think. I don't know if it'd be problematic for the committee to have everybody see how it's going and drafts and edits and things.
Was that a question for me? I apologize.
Yeah, that was a question for you, Tom.
That's a good question. If it was made open to the public, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure the answer to that. But again, my advice on this would be that in the interest of transparency, and to make sure that public notice is given so that the public is actually aware of the process, I would advise against using kind of a publicly available document as a way to not have to go through the public meeting process. So I'm a little hesitant to recommend something like that.
Wonderful, thank you. Judy and then Sam.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask a question back to Tom on that. I mean, would there be any value in checking on that? I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, from the standpoint of being able to work together as a group, if we have to work within the confines of the Bagley-Keene Act, then that's going to constrain time. So, I mean, if we're fully transparent with the document, and we're not opening it up for everybody's comments, but we're opening it up for availability. I mean, I feel like it would be worth looking into.
And I'm happy. Yes, I'd be happy to look into that specific question. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then.
Wonderful. Why don't you do that, Tom, and then just get the information back to Augustin and Judy for us as our chair and co-chair. Sam and then Pam.
Yeah, so maybe we can pose a question is like, what are our options in terms of being able to work outside of these public meetings to get this document, this guidance document done on time? I'm sure, maybe there's some options based on past committees that worked on these types of deliverables. So are there any recommendations that, Tom, you or someone else can make so that we can work outside of these meetings?
I think I would just reiterate, I can't, I think maybe Peter suggested this. I would just reiterate the suggestion of delegating specific tasks to smaller groups within the subcommittee, and then having them share their recommendations or work products at these regular scheduled
At the larger meeting. So what if we did this? What if Judy and Augustin, what if we determine, we take the outline from this meeting today, this draft outline of what this document is going to look like. We divide it up into the chunks, into the 5 smaller chunks or whatever it ends up being, and start pushing this information out. And then determine who is going to be responsible. Because one of the other goals we had for this meeting today was to assign roles and responsibilities. So I think, I don't know if we're actually going to be able to accomplish that today, because we're not 100% sure exactly what the components of the draft document are going to be. But I don't know. I'm kind of grasping at straws here. Pam, you had your hand up, and then Judy.
Yeah, I just wanted a clarification, like the Bagley Clean, it even prevents us from saying, okay, here's the 3 documents that we all want to review before the next meeting. We can't send that out, have one person send that out within the group, just to make sure that we're looking at the same link. Is that true, Tom, that we can't share that basic information?
I think it's okay to distribute materials. It's
okay.
In anticipation of a meeting. I think the concern is whether you're communicating about the contents of documents and making recommendations or that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, if we could share research material, I think that would be helpful, so that we can say, okay, here's the 3 documents we want to review before the next meeting. Come prepared to discuss that. Maybe then we have that next meeting sooner. My other suggestion is, we've got 2 chairs, we've got 10 people. What if we start breaking up into 2 smaller groups just off the bat?
I see Judy shaking her head.
Yeah.
Oh, yay.
You're on mute, Judy, but yeah.
Yeah, Judy, was that going to be your suggestion?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
2 groups of 5.
2 groups of 5. So what do we want those 2 groups of 5? Let's make that decision now. Judy, Augustin.
I mean, I would just say, just whatever everybody's preference would be.
Yeah.
We could pick like it's kickball if we wanted to, but
I was gonna say, let's take it back to elementary school.
Exactly.
Yeah, and the chairs can talk to each other, right?
Yes.
Right.
Assign me where you need to, but I have another meeting I gotta go to, so thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Diane. Or thank you, Corinne, sorry.
Carol, but that's okay.
Oh, no, Diane. Carol. Oh my God. Diane, I thought you had to leave early.
I did, but I came back.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right, so 2 groups of 5. Who do we want them to be? Augustin, pick your team. Carol, Judy, pick your team. Let's just get this done.
Should we do what people want to work on, or just take it random?
Well, unless we take the outline that we have determined that we think that the document is going to be, and then start splitting it up that way, which I don't know that we have time to do. We only have 2 minutes left in our meeting. Christopher, I'm not sure what to do at this point and what's the best way to move forward.
You can fed notes, but I think one of the suggestions based on people who are viewing this is we have one group review all of the guidance documents, and then we have the second group sort of set the outline of kind of where these guidance documents.
Especially since the review of the guidance documents seemed to be a pretty hefty lift. All right, so Augustin, which one do you want to take? The reviewing of the guidance documents or just creating the foundational outline? Or Judy?
I'll take the documents.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so who wants to be on, raise your hand if you want to be on Augustin's team.
That's
It's gonna be like
outline,
kickball.
right?
Team one is the outline of the draft document. So Peter wants to be on that. Sam wants to be on that. I need 2 more. Andrew wants to be on that, and Diane wants to be on that. Everyone else, Are you okay with being on team 2 with Judy and reviewing the previously validated documentation? Everyone cool with that? Any big issues there? All right, wonderful. So now we've assigned roles and responsibilities. We've also kind of found a way, I hate to say this, but we found a way to be able to work within the guidelines of Bagley-Keene, right? Yay.
Yay.
All right, next. The last thing is to get a meeting date set for our next meeting. When do y'all want to meet next? Do we set the actual date? Is that what we're looking to do here?
So here's a question. What about like the first Thursday of each month?
Anyone have a problem with the first Thursday of each month?
Well, that puts us on April Fool's Day to start with, but
How
Maybe so, I don't know.
perfect.
no indications there.
Any big issues with the first Thursday of every month?
The first-
Afternoon is okay.
And the first one in August, I am going to be out for, but everything else is fine. I guess we can cross that bridge when we get there.
Absolutely. Cool. Yeah, Diane.
I need to leave at 3:45 on Thursdays because I have a standing appointment. So if we moved it just a tiny bit earlier, I could be there, or I would miss the end of the meeting.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So it sounds to me like the first Thursday. So the next one will be April the 1st. Yay. What time do we want to make it be for? What can we all agree upon?
For the time, I think we can set up a doodle poll. Like
Okay,
we've done,
perfect.
and that way we can get a better idea. We may need to include other dates if we get too many folks that aren't available on that day. So
Wonderful.
we'll,
Thank you.
We'll help with that.
Thank you, Christopher. Are there any action items based upon what we have discussed so far, any outstanding action items that we need to make sure we address before we come to that next meeting on April 1st?
Hi, Rick, it's Kate. I
Hey,
hate to
Kate.
jump in and make you move back. I know we're a bit over time here, but Erica Calve did have a public comment on item number 4 as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erica. Please go for it.
Actually, I think I'm good. I was just kind of reserving a spot just in case. So thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for remembering, Kate, but I don't have any comments.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So any action items that we need to address? I believe that covers everything on our agenda. Christopher, do you see anything that I've left off or that I've missed?
Yeah, I just need to verify that we have no public comments for anything outside of the agenda items. And so give me a sec and I'll give a check on
Sure.
that.
Thank you. While he's doing that, I want to thank everyone for allowing me to be here with you today. I hope it was a pleasurable experience for you, because sometimes these meetings can be tough.
You
Great
did a
job.
great job. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, and I got word that we have no public comments on any items outside of the agenda.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank everyone for your time today. Thank you for your willingness to serve on this subcommittee, and I will call this meeting adjourned.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.